encompass the Palestinian struggle at this time. There's no question that I'm not going to go into what's in the Middle East. This is a special time in the Middle East, and I believe that the panels that will focus on Palestine will be most interesting. We have a stellar program. Our program today, of course, comes at the occasion of the 100th anniversary, and in the same month as the Balfour Declaration, with which most probably everybody here is familiar with, so I won't go into any of that. And I will touch on that in my closing remarks this afternoon. But we have three panels. The first panel is that of the occupation and Israel's human rights violations. This will be moderated by the Palestine Fund Treasurer, Dr. Eid Mustafa, who is to my extreme right here. And the second panel will be on the policy, media, and the Palestine issue, and will be moderated by the Palestine Center senior scholar, Dr. Edmund Gharib, who's a media specialist. And the third panel this afternoon will encompass Jerusalem, Gaza, and the PDS, and will be moderated by the Palestine Center Committee member, Mr. Saeed Arifat, who is also in the audience. We will have a 15-minute break between the first and second panel, and at about 12:30 we will have lunch for about 1 hour, at which time everybody can network and mingle and so on, and buy books which are available outside. I assure you that they are most interesting. But before I pass the mic to Dr. Mustafa, I would like just to mention a few ground rules. Please silence your phones. I did mine, you know, those things that may be open and everything else. So that will help. And in the question and answer period after each panel, please keep your questions to one per person, so everybody has had a chance to ask their questions. And keep it as questions rather than comments or speeches, which we've had sometimes, but I know that nobody here is going to do that today. With that, I'm going to ask Dr. Mustafa to start the first panel. Dr. Eid?
I also would like to welcome each and every one of you to this special day for us. And it's my pleasure to moderate this session. And thank you, Dr. Ali, for your introduction. Our first panel will be, as Dr. Ali mentioned, will be addressing the occupation and Israeli human rights violations. Our speakers will discuss the 50-year Israeli occupation, with Ali Abu Niameh discussing the Palestinian Authority security coordination with the Israeli occupation forces, Dr. Abdelrazak Tikriti discussing resistance to current colonial policy, and Dr. Alon Ben Meir discussing Israeli human rights violations against Palestinians, the overall political process, and the psychological dimension of the conflict. Ali Abu Niameh, to my far right, is a co-founder and executive director of the widely acclaimed Electronic Intifada, a non-profit, independent, online publication focusing on Palestine. I highly recommend it. He's the author of One Country, a bold proposal to end Israeli-Palestinian impasse, and The Battle for Justice in Palestine. He has been an active member of the movement for justice in Palestine for many years. Alon Ben Meir, in the middle of the head table, is a professor and senior fellow at New York University's Center for Global Affairs and the senior fellow at World Policy Institute. He hosts Global Leaders Conversations with Alon Ben Meir, a speaking series of debates and conversations with top policymakers from around the world, held at NYU each semester. He writes a weekly article that appears in scores of newspapers, magazines, and websites, including the Huffington Post, Jerusalem Post, Middle East Times, Times of Israel, and many others, in Arabic and in English. He has authored 7 books related to the Middle East and is currently working on a new book about the psychological dimension of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And to my immediate right, Dr. Abdelrazak Takriti, a great addition to our community in Texas. Welcome, Abid. Is Associate Professor and the inaugural holder of the Arab American Educational Foundation Chair in Modern Arab History at the University of Houston. He's the author of the award-winning book, Monsoon Revolution, Republicans, Sultans, and Empires in Oman, 1965 to 76. He is also the co-author and co-curator with Professor Carmen Abossi of the Palestinian Revolution website, learnpalestine.politics.ox.ac.uk. Professor Takriti holds a Doctor of Philosophy from St. Anthony College, University of Oxford, and is a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society. Please help me welcome our speakers. Ali Abu Ni'mah will start, and each speaker will speak for 15 minutes, and there will be time for questions and answers, followed by Abdelrazak Takriti, and last but not least, Dr. Alon Bemir at his request.
Thank you, Dr. Eid and Dr. Ali, and thank you to the Palestine Center for having me back. It's always a pleasure to be among friends, as many of you are, and also to see some new faces who I hope will find our comments beneficial. In just a few minutes, we've all been given a tall order. The question that I was asked to discuss is about, or the broad theme is, the occupation in Israel's human rights violations, with a particular focus on the Palestinian Authority. And what I thought that I might want to do is step back, really, to look at those questions critically. I think that the framing of the question, the occupation and Israel's human rights violations, contains some assumptions that are very, very common in all of our discussions about Palestine going back many decades, which is that Israel's human rights violations, which of course are legion and very well documented, and most will be familiar, are a thing which somehow exists separate from Israel and which can be addressed and remedied separate from Israel itself. And there's a whole industry to do that. There are many human rights organizations, Palestinian, Israeli, international, which exist to do that. And don't misunderstand what I'm saying. They do critically important work documenting these abuses. There is, of course, the European Union, which pretends to care about human rights and talks about a human rights dialogue with Israel, where in their model, Israel is this state, and there are these unfortunate human rights violations, and we could talk to Israel, and giving them enough incentives and rewards, they will stop their human rights violations. And that's a very common framework. But I think it's important, especially on this moment of the Balfour centenary, to really understand that Zionism is a system founded on the denial of the existence of the Palestinian people. Zionism is a system that always has and still does seek the destruction of the Palestinian people. Zionism posits that the Palestinians don't exist as a people. It sometimes has to grudgingly accept the reality that they do exist. But because they exist, and they refuse to be negated and denied and destroyed, then a great amount of violence is needed in order to suppress that reality and to try to suppress the existence of the Palestinian people. And that's what I mean by human rights violations. Really, we're talking about everything from, as we might commonly understand human rights violations to be daily abuses. Everything from that to genocide is foundational to Zionism. Of course, the Israeli state was founded on the destruction of Palestine, the destruction of the existing community and the expulsion of its people. And this wasn't, of course, a one-time event, but was something that has continued throughout the history of the Israeli entity. And just pointing out, even yesterday in Haaretz was published the declassified minutes of the cabinet meetings that followed months after the 1967 war, in which the Prime Minister at the time, Levi Eshkol, spoke about the need to expel the Palestinians from the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip. So from the very first moment, the Israeli leaders understood that they intended to conquer the territory forever. The problem was how to get rid of the people. And he told the ministers, quote, that he was working on the establishment of a unit or office that will engage in encouraging Arab emigration. He added, we should deal with this issue quietly, calmly, and covertly, and we should work on finding a way for them to emigrate to other countries, not just over the Jordan. He also, and in a frightening premonition of the horrific future that Israel created in Gaza, he said that in Gaza, precisely because of the suffocation and imprisonment there, maybe the Arabs will move from the Gaza Strip. That was in 1967. And look at the suffocation and imprisonment that Israel has imposed now deliberately on the Gaza ghetto. He even said, perhaps if we don't give them enough water, they won't have a choice because the orchards will yellow and wither. And of course, we see across Palestine that Israel systematically deprives Palestinians of water in the Jordan Valley. And where it doesn't deprive them of water, it poisons the water, as in Gaza. By poisons, I mean it creates the conditions in which the water becomes toxic to human life through the destruction of the aquifers and the systematic destruction of the irrigation and water treatment facilities, such that the sea in Gaza is now so polluted that even Israeli beaches, like it only gets international headlines where they have to close the Israeli beaches because of the biological warfare that Israel wages on the inmates of the Gaza ghetto. It's also important to note, and this is illustrated by a quote from the cabinet minutes of the time from Yigal Allon, who many of you will know is the author of the so-called Allon Plan, which has really formed the basis of every so-called peace plan ever since, which is to give the Palestinians some form of minimal autonomy while Israel controls the land. And he told the cabinet that it was necessary to thin the Galilee of Arabs, which again illustrates that this Zionist project of destruction of the Palestinian people makes no distinction between Palestinians in the occupied West Bank on the one hand and Palestinian citizens of the other. There are degrees of how Israel treats them, but fundamentally all Palestinians are viewed by Zionism as a demographic threat and an obstacle to Zionist expansion and control. And Zera Warhaftig, the Minister of Religious Affairs at the time, said, quote, "We must increase the number of Jews and take all possible measures to reduce the number of Arabs." It comes up in a sentence the entire policy of Zionism from the beginning until now. Jump forward 50 years, and these statements are in no way exceptional or out of character for Israeli leaders. You don't need to look far. You can look, for example, at the Israeli Deputy Prime Minister Tzachi Hanegbi, who threatened a few months ago a third Nakba against the Palestinians. He was referring, of course, to 1948 and 1967 being the first two and threatening a third. Or you can take Ayelet Sheket, the Justice Minister of Israel, who in 2014 notoriously published, I'm very proud that the Electronic Intifada were the first to translate it and publish it and give it the global notoriety it deserves, and this still dogs her wherever she goes around the world, something I'm very proud of, in which she called for the destruction of the Palestinian people, their towns, their villages, their elderly, and the killing of Palestinian mothers who, quote, give birth to little snakes. Genocidal language that you could take from the worst annals of history. And this is the Justice Minister who has received all over the world with a red carpet. Or Moshe Feiglin, who was then Deputy Speaker of the Knesset, who during the Gaza war published on Facebook a post calling, quote, to concentrate the Palestinians in Gaza even more than they are now and exterminate. Concentrate and exterminate. His words. You also don't need to go very far to see that the Israeli government, and we're not talking about minor figures, but from the Prime Minister on down, have absolutely no interest whatsoever in the so-called two-state solution. Their goal remains consistent with the foundational goal of Zionism, which is to conquer the land without the people. And if the people can't be gotten rid of physically, then they must be gotten rid of politically by denying them rights, denying them civil rights, in a system that is totalitarian as far as the Palestinians are concerned. It affects not just Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza or in present-day Israel, but all Palestinian refugees as well, who are denied the right to return to their country solely on the racist basis that they're not Jews. An unprecedented demand from Israel, which has not been accepted in the case of any other country or conflict. For example, Bosnia, the Dayton Accords, the right of return was fundamental, and the fact that Serbs might not have wanted Muslim Bosnians to return home, or Muslim Bosnians might not have wanted Croat or Serb refugees to return home, had no value and no regard in international law. And the Dayton Accords that were guaranteed by the United States guaranteed the right of return, regardless of the racial or ethnic prejudices of the authorities controlling the land to which the refugees were returning. In fact, more than 500,000 refugees returned under international law. Nobody paid any attention to any Serbs or Croats or Bosnians who would have said, but these returning refugees are a demographic threat because they're the wrong ethnicity or the wrong religion. This right to be racist is one which is foundational to Zionism. It cannot be separated from Zionism as a human rights abuse that is somehow can be remedied while keeping somehow a Zionist project intact. Where does the Palestinian Authority fit into this and its so-called security coordination with Israel? Well, this is a banal and old story, which is that every colonial regime, every occupation regime, eventually turns to natives to assist in its program of occupation and colonization and colonial control. And without going into detail, this is the function of the Palestinian Authority. And it is the one principle, let's say, Palestinian Authority constant. Everything else can be sacrificed. Jerusalem, the right of return, they're willing to accept the settlements, whatever it is. Anything can be sacrificed in the eyes of the Palestinian Authority except the security collaboration with Israel, to the extent that Mahmoud Abbas called it sacred. That's the word he used, that it's sacred. And that is the function that the Palestinian Authority plays, to the point where, of course, I think just the other day, the House, Saeed would know this better than me, he wrote a story on it yesterday, about that the House Foreign Relations Committee approved a bill to cut off funding to the Palestinian Authority. Every time I see that, I laugh. You hear these statements all the time from members of Congress saying, we want to cut off aid to the Palestinian Authority because of their incitement, because of this, because of that. Never happens. Never happens. Why? Because aid to the Palestinian Authority is aid to Israel. And as President Obama explained when he was arguing for Congress to renew that aid, the Palestinian Authority helps Israel. It helps Israel to protect the settlers. And of course, Barack Obama was telling the truth. That wasn't fake news. He said that the Palestinian Authority helps Israel to protect the settlements. The last thing I want to point out, in the spirit of the Balfour anniversary, and I would recommend on this that you read the really stunning article my friend and colleague, Professor Joseph Massad at Columbia University wrote that we published at the Electronic Intifada based on a speech that he gave at the National Assembly in France, really going into the history of the Balfour Declaration, and really fundamental to understand that it is the fruit of the collaboration between European anti-Semites and Zionists. Balfour himself, all the British leaders at the time, were Christian Zionists who shared the Zionist movement's goal of transporting the Jews out of Europe, particularly stopping the flood, as they saw it, of Jewish refugees from Europe into the United Kingdom at the time. And what I want to underscore, not just the historical aspect, but that this poisonous alliance is still at the heart of Zionism. And we see it today manifested in the close alliance developing between the 21st century Nazis in Europe and the United States and the Israeli far right. And I'm not just giving generalizations, let me be very specific. Yehuda Glick, a Likud lawmaker who is in the forefront of the Al-Aqsa destruction movement, he wrote the Likud party's platform on the Temple Mount, and is one of the most active in mainstreaming in Israel the idea of the destruction of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock in order to replace them with a Jewish temple, has formed a very close political alliance with the leaders of Germany's Alternative for Deutschland, anti-Semitic neo-Nazis, and the so-called Freedom Party in Austria. I've written about that at the Electronic Intifada. And here in the United States, we just saw last Sunday the Zionist Organization of America gala, in which the loudest applause was reserved for the Hungarian Nazi Sebastian Gorka, not to mention Steve Bannon and others. So to recognize two things: the continuity from the very beginning of the foundational Zionist goal of the destruction of the Palestinian people, and where they can't be destroyed, to control them under a totalitarian system where they can exercise their rights, apartheid, as it was accurately called in Dr. Virginia Tilley and Richard Falk's report, which I'm sure we'll be hearing about today, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the constant of the poisonous alliance between the most extreme anti-Jewish and, in these days, Islamophobic, anti-immigrant and racist forces in Europe and the United States. These are and have always been Israel's friends. And the way to end Israel's human rights abuses is to end the system of Zionism and to replace it with a system of full, equal, guaranteed rights for everyone, regardless of their race, religion, and ethnicity. That's the future we should be working towards. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali, and thank you, Dr. Eid, and thanks to the organizers of this wonderful event. I was actually hoping to speak last, not because I think the last word belongs to me, but because I want you to think about the future along Palestinian lines. And so even though I'm in the middle, I hope that you will bear in mind that we always have to go back to the original point, which is what is the way forward, and how can Palestinians take things forward. And I think to go towards that goal, we have to step back in history and understand what Balfour was about. And I'm very grateful that Ali ended on a Balfour note because it's not a small deal that we're living now, the 100th anniversary of this incredible colonial crime. One of the things that strikes me about Balfour is not just how it was conceived and why it was conceived. All these debates, you know, was it the Christian Zionists that were behind it, or was it British imperial interest? Those debates, you know, matter, but there's something much more interesting, which is why the policy was never reversed. You know, the British came into this terrain, and they found that the native population overwhelmingly does not want to have a population of settler colonists implanted on its land. And yet, the British consistently protected the project of establishing this settler colonial presence in this land, which eventually led to of course, the eradication of the native presence to some extent, to a great extent, and led to the realities that we see today. And part of the lack of reversal has to do with the outlooks of British policymakers. There's a quote from Churchill that I always like to appeal to when we're trying to think about this situation. In 1937, we had one of those periodic exercises where the British were confronting a major Palestinian rebellion, and they had to reevaluate what they were doing in Palestine. So they established the Peel Commission, and they were soliciting testimonies from different leaders. One of them, of course, was Winston Churchill, and he gave a confidential testimony in which he said, explaining his logic for why Palestinians should not have any political representation on the land, and why they do not have rights to the land, in fact, politically. He said, "I do not agree that the dog in a manger has the final right to the manger, even though he may have lain there for a very long time. I do not admit that right. I do not admit, for instance, that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or the black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong has been done to these people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, a more worldly wise race, to put it that way, has come in and taken their place." By the way, this was not just a rhetorical exercise on his part. He was not intervening in a public debate. He wasn't trying to promote an idea to the general public. This is how he thought. And this guy was the Secretary of the Colonies in the period when the British mandate was established in Palestine. And this is what we were dealing with then. And to some extent, it's what we are dealing with today. We have a basic idea, which is Palestinian rights are inferior to Jewish rights in that land, and currently, Israeli rights. In fact, there's this, and this has an impact on the engineering of institutions and on the way political developments on the ground unfold. So, what makes Balfour so astonishing is not just the fact that it was a settlement program, it had a settler colonial dimension to it, but also that it did not recognize and in fact omitted the Palestinian political rights. It first of all does not mention the Palestinian people. Secondly, it talks about civic and religious rights, in the declaration if you go back to the text, but it omits, in a glaring omission, any form of political rights. In the meantime, when the British administration was set up in Palestine, they recognized the political rights of the people who were not yet there. Already, the Jews in Europe had political rights there by virtue of the British government recognizing the Jewish National Fund, the Jewish organization at the time, as the Jewish agency, as the representative of that population that was going to settle the land. Now, why is this relevant to the present? It's relevant to the present because the Palestinians, since that moment, have been trying to establish their own political representation and their own political bodies that could fight this. In the mandate period, they established several Palestinian national congresses. This is how it started. You had, the first Congress and the second Congress and up to the seventh, and then they had bodies that developed out of that, like the Arab Higher Committee and so on and so forth, that came in very specific contexts. And the British were trying to thwart this effort too. And in the Peel Commission report, we see why they were thwarting this effort. They actually say, look, if we had Palestinian political representation there, we would not be able to pursue the settlement program. They will oppose this formally. They will give us a hard time. They'll be better organized in doing it. It was important to keep this native population fragmented. It was important to keep it with multiple leaderships that have no coherent agenda. It was important to get some of those leadership to be involved in containment policies and so on and so forth. And throughout the mandate we saw that. You'd have part of the Palestinian people rebelling, the majority, and then some leaders behind closed doors trying to quiet things down or trying to reach miserable little deals with this project that's out there to destroy it. And the logic was always the same. Well, if we don't reach a deal now, then we won't get anything. It's better to get something, and in the meantime, the project continues. And this grinding machine that is almost unstoppable in its force, because it's a very focused force. Saying, we've got this small piece of land, we're going to take it over. And we'll do everything that's possible to remove this tiny little people that's on it. These tiny little people, just like so-called Red Indians of the Americas, just like the so-called Black Australians, need to be removed. And what does this mean now? Let's think about it. When Palestinians were expelled eventually as a result of this Balfour policy in 1948, they were in the worst position possible when it comes to their presence on the land, because a lot of them were no longer on the land. But politically, they had some opening to be able to start thinking about how to organize themselves. They no longer had the British on top of them. They had now different realities to deal with. They had the reality of being dispersed among several Arab states, all of which, for their own reasons, were hostile to the idea of Palestinians organizing and having independent organizational capacity. And that's why we didn't see, between 1948 and 1964, we didn't see an official Palestinian body representing the Palestinian people. There was Hukumat Palestine, the All-Palestine government, but it was basically restricted to one office in Cairo and did not have adequate recognition from the Arab states. Throughout that period, Palestinians had to organize in ways that were underground, clandestine, and they were basically establishing revolutionary movements or getting involved in Palestinian pan-Arabist parties that were seeking to overthrow the status quo across the Arab world with an eye to liberating Palestine. I know you know that story, but it's always important to bring it back to the present and think about how it fits in with our world now. Those movements eventually allowed for the creation of a Palestinian political system centered around the liberation of Palestine. And once the Palestinian National Representative Body was created in '64, there was the capacity to have a national liberation movement with different pluralist ideologies operating under its umbrella. But you had a representation system, and you had a way of bringing the people together. That was what the British effectively prevented in the past, and it's what was effectively suppressed in a later period. After the exit from Beirut, of course, and all the pressures of the 80s, and eventually the signing of Oslo, we lost that political system. We lost that ability to have a major anti-colonial movement that had its own agenda, and that had a very clear agenda, which is liberation and return. It was not an agenda of building a state. Some people, now some historians, they write in their books, oh, it was a search for a state. Not true. It was not a search for a state, that period. That period was a search for liberation and return. If you go to all the writers, all the same people at the time, if you interview folks from that period, they all say the same thing. We wanted to liberate the land and return to it. And they had a framework for doing so. Like every other national liberation movement, they had a body, a national representative body, they had political parties connected to that body, and they had plans and ways of deliberating policy through something that we lost now, which is the Palestine National Council. Palestine National Council now exists but in name, not in practice. And the force of having something like that is immeasurable. Because when you're organized, and when you have several million people who are inspired by the existence of a national movement, and who put their energies in a focused way into overthrowing this colonial reality that we live in, that Ali has so eloquently described, that's when you can do something. But at the moment, what has happened was a parallel structure was created, the Palestinian Authority, which, as Ali has rightly pointed out, has been a structure that basically acts to contain Palestinian resistance. That's a big part of its current functions. It's not the only function it plays, but it's one of them, and it's a major one. That structure has taken over the PLO, effectively, even though it was supposed to operate under the PLO. What it did was basically control the state. Now the president of the Palestinian Authority is also, of course, the president of the PLO, the chairman of the PLO, and the former role is more important than the latter because all the money is in the Palestinian Authority. And all that money, by the way, is European money and American money and money that is coming from sources that are hostile to the agenda of Palestinian freedom. They do not want to see the return of the refugees. They do not want to see a genuine sense of self-determination. They do not want to see an end to Israeli colonization. If they did, they'd stop sending nuclear weapons to Israel. They'd stop sending fighter jets to Israel. They'd stop sending all the machinery that does the killing and that does the destruction on the land. And they would stop giving diplomatic protection for this project that has been going on for the past 100 years. And they would not be celebrating Balfour in the British Parliament like they so shamefully did very recently. So, as Palestinians, we have to recognize that we have a problem in our own political structure now. Our institutions have been hijacked. They have been frozen in space and time. The PLO now is nothing but a stamp in Abu Mazen's pocket. And with it, he basically approves policies that are not popular and that are not acceptable to the Palestinian people and that do not accord with the Palestinian national consensus. So, what is the solution to that? Some people were like, okay, let's rebuild the national movement, let's forget about the PLO. That's not good. Because what we're dealing with, PLO was born in a very specific moment. If you're a historian, you'd pick that. It's actually the only moment in time where you could have had representation for the Palestinian people was 1964. There was no other year where it could have happened. Why? Because you had Jamal Abdel Nasser there, and he put his full weight behind the idea of establishing Palestinian representation. Now, first of all, you don't have leadership in the Arab world that's going to back this. And on the contrary, they want to disperse the Palestinian people even further. They see them as a headache, as an obstacle. Okay? So, the Arab regional situation doesn't allow for the rejuvenation of any other body. And secondly, our people need to reclaim institutions that are already there. They don't need to reinvent the wheel. We already had a very good functioning formula. It had its problems and they could be overcome. But the formula is basically the same formula that was used by every anti-colonial movement. You know, in South Africa, they had the African National Congress. You know, in Vietnam, they had their own national bodies that were dealing with this. In Nigeria, they had the FLN. You need to have that. We had the PLO. And we still do in name, but we don't have it in reality. Because it's hijacked. We need to be able to free it. We need to be able to engage our young people in it. We need to be able to have our parliament, the Palestine National Council, and that will fulfill certain needs for Palestinian communities across the world. It will remind people that Palestinian refugees are part of the Palestinian body politic. At the moment, they've been expelled from the Palestinian body politic through the creation of the Palestinian Authority, which has elections, but the only people that vote are in the West Bank and Gaza. That's very shameful. It means saying you're not Palestinian if you're not living in the West Bank and Gaza. What about everybody else? They need to have a say in our political system. They need to be part of the political system. Every Palestinian American child needs to be able to elect their representative to the PNC. And by doing so, restore their connection to the national movement as a whole. Every Palestinian should have the option of being able to contribute to this struggle to liberate their land through this national institution. So our political architecture needs to be reformed, and that's the way forward. That's the way we can actually develop a coherent strategy, because at the moment we don't have a strategy for how to deal with this Israeli machine. We always talk about how bad it is. We always talk about, you know, the horrible realities that are going on the ground. We talk about the variety of tactics that we're employing, and some of them are inspiring, beautiful things like the BDS movement and like other movements that are achieving some successes. But you can't just have solidarity operating alone. That doesn't work. You need to have solidarity structures, you need to have a national liberation movement, and then you need to mobilize geopolitical forces from across the world to support it. That's the only way you can achieve liberation. And we know that from every anti-colonial case, not just from our own history, but from the history of all oppressed people across the world. Thank you very much.
Good morning to all of you. Thank you for having me with you this morning. I want to thank you, Eid, for the invitation, and thank you for your introduction. You know, I will deviate somewhat from what's been said before, and I want to state from the very outset that I have been and continue to be supporter and have fought for nearly 30 years for the establishment of independent Palestinian state. I want to be categorical about my position in this regard. because how to go about it, that is what matters to us today. Repeating the historical account of what happened 100 years ago and rehashing that history, however destructive it may be, it is not going to bring the Palestinian people one step closer to establishing a Palestinian state. And I think for us to think in real practical terms, we have to really change our approach, our attitude, our perception of what exists today, and formulate a strategy that is going to work. Or else, what we are hearing, and with absolutely due respect to the speakers before me, it's a preaching to the convert. You do not need to be convinced about the Israeli occupation. Occupation is evil and it must end. You do not need to know what happened 20 years ago, 30 years ago. All the violations of human rights have been occurring and perhaps will continue to occur. You know that. The question today for us is, how do we change the picture? How do we create an environment that is going to be conducive to the creation of an independent Palestinian state? That must be the focus, rather than be a prisoner of the past. By hashing and rehashing, we are not coming any closer to where we were 10 years ago, 15 years ago. I want to remind you of something else. With the policy that the Palestinians have taken, however correct it might seem to most Palestinians, what has happened actually in the last 50 years since the occupation? You have 650,000 settlers. A result of what? Certainly as a result of the Israeli ambition, but would that have been possible had the Palestinian strategy been different? And I want to speak about that because this is extremely important. That is, if you must recognize today that what you've done in the last 50 years did not produce any result. Period. In fact, made the situation considerably worse for the Palestinians. So what we have to understand here that the policy of resistance did not work, and it's not working. And reaching out to the world, to the United States, to the European community, and trying to convince them about the cause of the Palestinian, however correct and right it is, it has not produced any result. And I must tell you, no matter what you try to do, as far as the international community is concerned, you are not going to realize a significant change in the attitude of the United States, in the attitude of most of the European countries, because this is the position they have taken. Israel has been getting that support for the last 70 years. And I don't think that's going to change in any dramatic way, no matter what you do, unless you change your own strategy. The second point I want to make is that you refer to Israel as if it was one single unit, monolithic society. You are wrong. There are 14 different political parties. The current government is center and right of center. Netanyahu and his government are against the establishment of a Palestinian state, period. But to ignore the left, a left of center, it's a terrible mistake. And I must tell you, if you want to change the dynamics, don't talk about the evils of this current government. There is a lot of evil things that are doing. You need to reach out to the left, to the center and left of the Israelis. I must tell you today, I've just been there, I go there for scores of times a year. You have community in Israel. I dare to say more than 55, 60% of the Israelis want to see an end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and want to see a Palestinian state. But you are not appealing to them. When you love them, all of Israel, if it was a single entity, you need to address yourself to the Israeli left and the Israeli center. And to them you need to appeal, not to the United States. This is the group that are fighting day in and day out against the government to try to achieve a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But what we've been doing here, we've been not allowing ourselves to examine what is really that needs to be done. I address in my various writing and books is that there is a psychological dimension to the conflict that has not been touched upon at all. There's a historic narrative. There's a religious narrative. There's an ideological narrative. And that's been reinforced over 70 years. So if you go to Israel to a boy in the West Bank and ask him, he will recall the Intifada as if it happened yesterday. And you go to the Israel and you talk to a boy 10 years old, he will recall the Holocaust as if it happened yesterday. What we have done, what the Israelis have done, what the Palestinians have done, continue to the victimization of their own people by perpetuating this historic narrative. That has to stop. The second thing we need to understand is the acceptance of coexistence. I must tell you, we can talk, many Israelis can talk, we want all of the land. Some Palestinians, like Hamas and others, we have to admit that, also would like to see this destruction of the state of Israel. But both sides must recognize that coexistence is not one of many options, it's the only option. And to suggest that the Israelis will someday be able to chase out all Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza is completely baseless assumption. You know why? Look at the demographic growth. In 1948, there were only 170,000 Palestinians living in Israel proper. Today, there are now 1,800,000. That's 10 times. The Palestinian community grew between 6 and 7 to 10 times in the West Bank and Gaza and in Israel proper. There is no way any Israeli government today or in the future to be able to chase the Palestinians. They realize one thing, coexistence is a reality, they cannot change, and it will not change. And they'll have to accept it. The question is, how do they want to coexist? Do they want to kill each other for another 70 years? Or do they want to create a formula whereby they can live peacefully with one another? That is the choice. It is a choice for the Palestinians, and it is a choice for the Israelis. And I maintain that neither side wants to live under these present conditions for another 70 years. Then, we have to consider today also the changing environment in the region. I believe that Abdul Razak mentioned this point. Changing environment today in the Middle East, and I'm talking primarily about the Arab states. You take the Gulf states led by Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan. Their focus today is on Iran. From their perspective, the problem, the threat to the Arab world today comes from Iran. The Palestinian-Israeli conflict is put back on the back burner. Whether you like it or not, I talk to them, I know exactly what they are saying. What I'm saying, suggesting to you today, the strategy that you need to develop as Palestinian in order to make the proper inroad, you have to consider all these elements. The changing environment of the region, the mutual correct claim of both sides. As long as you keep denying, for example, and it's been said time and again, do the Jews have religious claim of any kind to that land? And if you deny that, then you're going to have this conflict will continue for another 70 years. Is there a historic account to which the Jews are connected to that land? If you deny that, we are perpetuating the conflict. And vice versa. Israel too must recognize that the Palestinians have religious right, historic right, just the same. And there is ideological component that strengthen these historic, religious, and ideological narratives. What we are saying to you that today, I want to see peace in my lifetime. 30 years ago, 35 years, 33 years ago to be exact, I wrote my dissertation, my PhD dissertation, and it was imperatives and choices. imperative and choices, then I preach the two-state solution. And you know what? I received threats from Palestinians as well as Israelis. How dare you speak about Palestinian state, the Israelis will say. And the Palestinians said, this is our land. We cannot allow the Israelis to have their own state. I was threatened, and to this day I continue to be threatened, because I do not take the Israeli line or the Palestinian, because I think both wrong many times and both right many times. So please understand, to repeat what all this resolution and what happened in the Balfour Declaration and in '94, however tragic these events may have been, they are not going to move you one single inch forward unless you change direction. And when we talk about resistance, let me define to you what I consider resistance. Resistance not by knifing, killing Israelis, not by ramping cars against Israelis. How about civil disobedience? I was preaching, and I talked to the Palestinian Authority. I said, can you organize 50,000 women to go into the street without knives, without clubs, and just sit down? Then the whole world will pay attention to 50,000 men, women, and children in the street as civil disobedience. You need there are means by which you can approach this conflict in a peaceful manner to prove to the whole world that the Palestinian is a viable, real community, deserve to have independent state, and Israel, under no circumstances, will be able to prevent that from happening as long as you create, and with that I will conclude. Today you have a very strong community left of center in Israel. They all want peace. They all want to have peace. Appeal to them. Appeal to the Israeli left. Because this government in Israel today will not allow the establishment of Palestinian state. Period. You need a change of government. And the only government that can make that difference is a government composed of the left and center. And to that you need to appeal. Not to the United Nations. To those Israelis who want to have peace, and they are able to do so as long as they are getting the kind of narrative coming from the Palestinians supportive of their ideas. I want to tell you something. Many Israelis on the left and center are afraid to talk today, and because they are labeled as traitors if they speak about Palestinian state. You need to give them, you, the Palestinians, need to give them the opportunity to say, no, we, the Palestinians, want peace. Our resistance is going to be peaceful. Our approaches and approaches are going to be all peaceful. Strengthen the hand of the left. Allow them to go. There's an election next year in 2019, early 19. This is a time to begin to build those kind of bridges by beginning that people to people reconciliation process. That's what you need to change the dynamic of the conflict through a reconciliation process, allowing the government, a new government to rise in Israel, and then, only then we can begin to talk in earnest about the future of the Palestinian people living and free in a democratic state called Palestine.
Thank you, Dr. Ben-Meir. He has to be the last speaker, and I can see why. So for the sake of a lively discussion, I would like to ask our panelists today to make some comments, then I'll open the floor for questions and answers. Abed, would you like to start?
Sure. I mean, with all due respect to Dr. Alon, this is why I did not want you to speak last.
This is why I wanted to speak.
Of course. But the last word has to be a Palestinian word in this, and that's very important. And this is the substance of my comment, Dr. Alon, to what you said. What you rehashed is basically the Abu Mazen policy. He has been appealing to the Israeli left. He has been broadcasting on Israeli television ads saying we want peace. He has given up core Palestinian rights, including the right of return, publicly. He says, I'm from Safad, but I don't want to go. He has done everything you're talking about and even more. And the entire Palestinian Authority has done the same. But what we're dealing with is not an issue of appealing to the psychology of Israelis. Honestly, what we're dealing with is much deeper. This is not about claims and counterclaims. This is about a settler colonial machine. And unless we call a spade, we will continue to run in circles. Okay? we have a situation, an entire government structure oriented towards what Ali has pointed out earlier, the eradication of the Palestinian people. They will not settle for anything less than that. Okay? Even if they do not achieve the full physical eradication from the land, they want to do political eradication. So, when we're dealing with that, the question that we have to ask is not how to appeal to them. That comes that part of the effort, but it's not the full effort. You know, how you strategize around appealing to a settler colonial population is a question that might be out there if you have a proper anti-colonial movement running. You know, and every anti-colonial movement had to, for example, used to try to appeal to the conscience of French people. They did not achieve great results. They had, you know, the Declaration of the 121. They had various manifestos appear from Jean-Paul Sartre and a few. You know, they had some movements in solidarity. But even the Communist Party in France did not stand with the struggle of the Algerian people for liberation. And the same goes for the so-called left in South Africa. You know, when you speak to someone like Ronnie Caswells or these true heroes of the South African struggle, they'll tell you, and he was one of the few white people that participated in that struggle. And you know, he would tell you, like, you could fit all the white people that helped in the 1960s in a telephone booth. There were literally like 3 of them. You know, this is the reality we're dealing with. So to speak in these terms is not helpful. It has actually failed. We need to go back to our people. We need to go back to our principles. We need to search for mechanisms through which we can deliberate our policies, because the last thing we need to also have now, along with all due respect, is Israelis telling us what we need to do. In the same way that African Americans here, the last thing they need to hear is white people telling them what they need to do. They have brains, they have minds, and they have deeper experiences of the oppression, and they know what they need to do. The only problem is that the obstacles are so great. The historical odds are so overwhelming. And that's why we're always in a situation where we're faced with the challenge of demoralization. What I see today is a host of young people. I just came from the National Students for Justice for Palestine conference a couple of weeks ago. The spirit there is amazing. Nobody's talking about defeat there. Everybody's ready to work and to overcome this terrible situation we're in. It's only when I'm surrounded by slightly, people from the previous generations, they're tired. Because this is a long-term struggle. That's what we need to understand. We're not gonna overturn settler colonialism in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years. It takes a long time. So we need to keep the spirit up. And we need to support our young people now and start opening avenues for them for participation in our struggle. Not try to shut it down by saying the only avenue available for you is to try to appeal to the Israeli left and say that you don't have any claims to broader Palestinian rights, like the right of return and others. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ali?
Thank you. I mean, what we heard from the gentleman to my left is a rehearsal of the same talking points we've been hearing from the so-called Israeli peace camp for as long as I remember, going back to the 1980s. And it's based on a number of myths, fabrications, and omissions. I mean, we've been hearing since the time of Peres, oh, give this Israeli peace camp a chance and support them and they want peace. It was the Israeli left that built the settlements and built the occupation. And who will be the prime minister in the very unlikely event that this so-called Israeli center-left wins the election? Presumably, let's say, Avi Gabbay, the head of what's left of the Israeli Labour Party. Avi Gabbay is a man who in the past few weeks has declared that the settlements are the beautiful face of Zionism. This is your Israeli peace camp. Avi Gabbay has declared that He will never allow Arab parties into his government. This is your Israeli left that wants peace for the Palestinians. I mean, it was very offensive and really blood-curdling to listen to being lectured about civil disobedience. Palestinians have been engaged in civil disobedience from hunger strikes, as now prisoners are on hunger strike in the brutal dungeons of this racist apartheid state. The most basic form of civil disobedience. Do you see international headlines about the hunger strikers? Is anyone paying attention to them? In the summer, we saw the brave, courageous civil disobedience of the people of Jerusalem that this racist colonial occupier is trying to replace. They went into the streets for 2 weeks with their hands, and the occupier responded with lethal force, killing them. They killed Palestinians for protesting against the effort to further take over the Al-Aqsa Mosque and to impose on it the kind of restrictions and divisions as the occupier has done in Hebron after the massacre by the American Jewish settler Baruch Goldstein. So this is your Israeli peace camp. Now let's talk about civil disobedience. The most promising manifestation of global civil disobedience in the past decade has been the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which is a nonviolent movement modeled on the struggle that helped to end apartheid in South Africa, which comes from the tradition of boycotts and civil disobedience of this country's civil rights movement. And every student in this country is taught about the civil rights movement as something to look up to. Boycotts are still going on in this country when Mississippi or Alabama or Indiana passes restrictions against trans people or the so-called religious freedom laws that actually, companies say, we're not going to go to Alabama, we're not going to go to Mississippi, we're not going to go to North Carolina. Nobody says that that kind of boycott is a call for the destruction of North Carolina or the destruction of Mississippi. Does anyone describe Martin Luther King calling for the destruction of Georgia because he demanded full and equal rights for all people there? So, so anyone who is serious about civil disobedience, who is not just lecturing in a patronizing and racist way to the Palestinians, would declare here and now their full, wholehearted support for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement.
First of all, I think due respect ought to be exhibited here, and to imply that I'm a racist is outrageous.
No, I don't say you're racist. Your discourse is racist. Your discourse is racist and patronizing.
I'm not patronizing. I work for the Israeli-Palestinian cause, for the Palestinian cause more than you have, for the last 13 years. I have been involved in every single negotiations behind the scene. That's what I do today. Track 2 diplomacy. Please don't preach me the gospel of what went on in these negotiations, because I know it firsthand. Both at Camp David in 2008 and 9, and 2013 and 14. I'm very much part of that behind the scene, because I have always taken a neutral position, and I wanted to make sure that the Israelis and Palestinians understand that neither can have it all.
There's no neutrality when it comes to injustice.
But what you are here, what you are saying, you are merely repeating the old, tired narrative that means nothing anymore. What is the solution to the future? Why don't you provide me a photo, a picture, a framework, what it is that you want to see, and how you... Let me finish, please.
With pleasure,
Yeah.
I'd like to do that.
When you get your chance.
Yeah, okay.
When you get your chance.
For sure.
The point here, let me ask 2 more sentences. The point here, you have a country called Israel. It's a powerful country. Not just in relation to the Palestinians, it's in absolute terms one of the most powerful nations that exists today. To suggest, and you talk about appeasing the Israeli. Since when Hamas appeased the Israeli? And you continue to claim that Hamas is part and parcel of the Palestinian body politic.
Well,
And what you do,
accepted the
can you
two-state
please stop
solution.
interrupting me for a moment?
They've accepted-
Can you
it's
please?
a discussion.
No,
It's
no,
not
let me
wrong.
finish my sentence. Let me finish my sentence.
No discussion.
We're
What
going to
you-
put an
no,
end to this
I
in a
am-
minute or so.
Just let me finish my sentence. What I am saying to you, groups like Hamas and others are playing into the hand of the right of center in Israel. You are giving them the excuse to do what they're doing today. You should not give them the excuse. If Hamas is getting so many millions of dollars and spend 2/3 of it or half of it on building tunnels, on buying, instead of building the structure that you very correctly refer to, the Palestinians ought to be focusing on building the structure of a statehood. That's what Hamas should have been done in Gaza. Nobody prevented Hamas from doing so.
We're
but
going to
they
try to
take that
conclude
money
this pretty
and
soon.
spend it on armaments and tunnels. This is what I'm saying. We've got to be honest with ourselves, because I am a believer and I want to see Palestinian state. Perhaps just as much as you do, if no more, because I lived it and I know what it takes, and I spent all my adult life in the search for a solution to this horrifying conflict.
I see so many hands raised, so I have to give time to the people who want to ask questions. But let me set some rules first, please. We would like people to ask one question per person. I don't want anybody to take over. No editorials, please. You need to identify yourself and any affiliation you may have. And you want to wait for the microphone to get to you. And for our online audience, please use hashtag PCCONF, that's Palestine Center Conference 2017. So with that, I will go to the first hand that came up right there, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Benjamin, a retired diplomat. I would have been disappointed if the panelists had all agreed with each other.
Good. You want action, you come right here.
I'm not disappointed. I do have a question for Dr. Ben Meir. That is the fact that, how do you account for the fact that whatever government has been in Israel, they have consistently supported the settlement movement and other measures which could be construed as anti-Palestinian. And I understand your support for civil disobedience, but it can be a part of a number of strategies, including the BDS movement. What is your position on the BDS movement and the Palestinian struggle for international recognition under international law? Thank you.
Right. I'm 100% in support of international recognition of a Palestinian state. And I've written extensively about the subject. And I think the fact that the United Nations Security Council has not passed this kind of resolution is abhorrent. To me, it's not totally unacceptable. The BDS, if you were to impose it fully, it won't work at all. All you have to look at the relationship, trade relations between Israel and Europe, between Israel and the United States, and Israel and the Far East, and you will realize that is not going to work. We are talking about reality here. You know, it's very easy to create some kind of an arrangement that is not going to work. What I am saying to you, does that mean that Israel should not be suffering some kind of consequences because of its action? I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that the Palestinians have the right to statehood. The question is what kind of strategies you need to pursue in order to realize that goal. That's where I'm coming from. I'm not against anything else other than I want to see that happen. The differences between us is not whether it should be Palestinian state or not, but the approach, the strategy. And this is where I differ completely, because I must ask you, when was it last time you were in Israel and talked to every member of the opposition? But when was it last time?
I think we do have a difference, actually.
Do you think we'd be allowed in? Do you think we'd be allowed in if we traveled there?
But let's clarify something.
They would be allowed in. Yeah.
Alon, I
What about the law? What about the seven French politicians who were barred from entering on Monday because of their political positions and because of their solidarity with the Palestinian people? I mean, you have to stop promoting this myth that this entity is a democracy or wants peace. The time for these myths are over. These old myths that falsely portray the situation as just a disagreement between equals who have, they have their views and they have, no, there is a colonial settler state, as Abed pointed out, and it needs to be reversed. I noticed you didn't answer the question about BDS, because you were asked whether you supported it, and your answer was it won't work. So you shifted to, well, it won't work, it's not practical, which is a clever way to avoid having to say I'm against it, which I suspect you are.
You're wrong.
Well, okay, all right. So, of course, the claim it won't work is always the claim that is made by settler colonial states, as it was with apartheid South Africa. We were told it won't work. All it will do is push the whites into a more defensive position, into the Lager mentality. And, I would also point you to the report, the leaked report, which the Electronic Intifada published in April from the Reut Institute and the ADL, which was endorsed by the Israeli government. It carried the endorsement of Sima Vakar-Gil, the head of the Director General of the so-called Ministry of Strategic Affairs, which has been given a $40 million budget to fight the BDS movement. And that report said that despite the 20-fold increase in spending over the past 6 years by Israel and its lobby groups around the world in trying to defeat the BDS movement, it acknowledged, and I quote from the report, the impressive growth and significant successes of this movement. So I'm happy to report that the Israeli government sees the BDS movement as growing, that it also points out that in addition to the visible aspects of the BDS movement, Israel is facing what it calls a growing silent boycott. Basically what this means is that the Israeli brand is tarnished, despite the efforts to sell this racist entity as innovative and green technology and loving of LGBT rights. The world gets it. The world, people understand, and they understand that Israel is a bad brand on that level, and they're staying away from it in droves. And no effort by Israel to deflect attention from the reality that it rules over millions of Palestinians who are deprived of the right to life, the right to life. What do I mean by that? Is that any Palestinian can be killed with total impunity. With total impunity, it happens. There was, in the past 30 years, one Israeli soldier who was convicted for the unlawful killing of a Palestinian, and that was Elor Azaria, the medic, someone who's supposed to be saving lives, who executed an injured Palestinian and became a national hero. Became a national hero. And they cried for him, and they played violins, and they had all these public manifestations. He was given a sentence of 18 months, and he didn't even serve it. And that was an exceptional case. In every other case, Palestinians are killed with impunity. Their land is stolen with impunity. Their houses are destroyed with impunity. And this isn't human rights abuses. This is Zionism. If you want peace, we have to end the system of Zionism and replace it with a system that grants full, equal, civil, political rights to Jews, to Christians, to Muslims, to atheists, to everybody. This is the 21st century. Enough of this colonial, racist nationalism. Zionism comes from the 19th century, and we should send it back there.
Excellent. I see an example of Palestinian resistance. A lady right there had her hand left, up. She came in with her hand up. So please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Mahan Assar. I'm an assistant professor of Middle Eastern and specifically Palestinian history at the University of Arizona. I want to thank you all for your remarks. My question is to Dr. Chakriti. I was very heartened by your call to reclaim existing institutions. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit and tell us a little bit more about the mechanisms of how that would take shape.
Thank you very much, Dr. Maha.
Please repeat that question.
I believe Dr. Maha was asking about the effort to reclaim national institutions and how that could be achieved and what's its relevance. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I want to start by saying I'm glad to hear this question because it refocuses us on the discussion rather than on cross-panel back and forth. And I think we should all be not personalizing things. These are different established political lines. Some people want to see an overthrowing of the colonial structure as a whole. Some people, like Dr. Elon, want only a Palestinian state, presumably within 67 borders, and they're operating within a particular logic, which sees Palestinians as basically needing to appeal to the Israeli public, and that's the way forward to liberation. I propose that is one tactic amongst many that could be pursued by Palestinians. It has been pursued. It has failed miserably, and in most colonial situations, these tactics fail. The real bigger question is the one that Dr. Maha was asking, which is what is the way for people to organize themselves, to have a path forward, to be able to have their entire national capacities mobilized in one direction, the direction of freedom. Yeah? And that's a tricky thing that faces every population facing the kind of colonial machine that we're facing. In the case of Palestine specifically, the big obstacle is at the moment money and guns. Okay. Money in the sense that there's a huge amount of investment that goes into the alternative structures, which are not there to empower Palestinians or include them in the political process, but to exclude them. And I'm talking here about the Palestinian Authority at the moment. Unfortunately, by creating institutions only within the West Bank and to a much lesser extent Gaza, what that does is it fragments the people. It doesn't bring them together. And the guns also contribute to this process because people are oppressed across the region, including in Palestine, but outside. They're not allowed to organize by military force. Okay? So Palestinians, if they want to organize in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Syria, inside Palestine, anywhere, they're faced with the power of the state. Okay, so we have a very challenging situation, but we need to organize, and we've got some vestiges from the past that could help us. These institutions, like the PLO or the PNC, although they only have at the moment symbolic value, they could be reactivated. The only problem is we don't have a movement to reactivate them that's very effective. Around the time of the Arab Spring, we were beginning to see that kind of movement emerging. There were some protests amongst Palestinian students and youth, in particular, demanding PNC elections. There were some efforts to develop a mechanism for doing elections across borders. By the way, Iraqi refugees and other refugee populations have been able to vote in elections across borders, so I don't see why that's not possible in the case of Palestine. But more importantly, it's not just an effort about elections. It's an effort about reminding ourselves that we have a task. And the task is not just to complain about what's going on. The task is to find ways of organizing ourselves beyond just the solidarity run. We can't be in solidarity with ourselves. We have to build a national movement and then complement that with a solidarity movement.
Very good. We will have to conclude in a few minutes. I had a burning question, but I can't. I'm standing in line, and some people asked before me. I'll give the mic to a gentleman who gets his way at the State Department. Saeed?
I'm actually, my name is Saeed Eric, I am a journalist. I'm amazed that Dr. Ben-Meir talks about the Israeli left as if there was an address to the Israeli left. What is the address to the Israeli left? What are they? Where are they? Where is the Israeli left? I remember when I was a student and we would demonstrate against the war in Vietnam and so on. I don't see Israeli students demonstrating against the occupation, calling for an end to the occupation. basically every Israeli that is, older than 17 years old has served in the military oppressing Palestinians, not on the move. So where is the left movement that is really against militarism, against occupation, supporting the Palestinians, going to their villages and so on without siege and control? So it is, tell us, perhaps you can direct it to where they are. And then I have a very quick question to both Ali and Abdel-Razak. I think that the Palestinian movement or resistance has become stagnant. What is the creative way forward to resist and end the occupation? Thank you.
Let's make it short, please.
Yeah, very short. Absolutely right. First of all, I want to repeat something that Abed said. Building Palestinian institutions, strengthening the Palestinian institutions is critically important. That is something that has been missing. It has to be focused. This is incidentally one of the most important messages to send to the Israelis, that we are focusing on building the state. That's kind of message when I talk about appealing. This is exactly what you are saying as well, is making happen. What the focus should be on building the institution of statehood. So the whole world will see there is a state in the making. This is very important. When you talk about the left, I must tell you, there is very strong, well operating left in Israel today. But you don't hear much of the left because there's no election going on as yet. But what we are seeing today, all you have to do, read the Israeli newspapers. Read the Israeli newspaper. Read the commentaries in Haaretz. Read the people who write about these kind of things. The public is very sick and tired. The majority, and I can tell you, time and again, polls are taken, sick and tired of the conflict. They need to see an end to it, and they talk openly about two-state solution. We go there, we talk to them. There are scores and scores of organizations in Israel. That's all they do is to promote peace based on a two-state solution. The one-state solution is never going to happen because no Israeli government, from the extreme left to the extreme right, will never allow to have one state and be governed by eventually a Palestinian majority. That's not going to happen.
Yeah.
That's not going to happen. Plain and simple. So focus on building the institutions, appeal by doing so, you appeal to the segment of the Israeli population that wants to end this occupation. And I think that's where should be the focus. You talk about a framework. I haven't heard as yet a framework for peace from anyone here yet.
Yeah, because we have just a couple of minutes. I want to give Ali and Abed the chance to respond to Saeed, and there will be time during the break for direct questions to the panelists. And we have plenty of time during the day to do that as well. My apologies to the hands that were raised. Yeah. So please make it short.
Yeah, we'll try to do that. First, to say to Saeed, thank you for the question. I feel a bit on the spot because I normally see you grill the State Department, so I'm a little bit scared when you stand up. But I think, the official Palestinian movement is definitely stagnant, and Abed's thoughts about that are very welcome and thought-provoking. But there is also a lot going on. I mentioned before the civil disobedience in Jerusalem, which many people have underestimated the capacity because of Israel's systematic attack on Palestinian institutions and civil society in Jerusalem for many decades. The Israelis themselves were surprised by the coherence and strength of the people of Jerusalem in resisting further encroachment. And that was dynamic, not stagnant. The BDS movement also is incredible. We don't have time to go into that. Let me just say briefly that, the claim we always hear that Israelis will never accept democracy, that they will never accept equal rights for Palestinians, I think is underestimating the capacity for people to change. Because when I studied this in South Africa, I looked at all the opinion surveys in the years going through the 1980s into the early 1990s, where solid majorities of whites, these were academic studies, opinion polls, solid majorities of whites said we will never accept a one-person, one-vote system, that would be suicide for us. F.W. de Klerk said we will never accept one person, one vote at the beginning of the negotiations to end the racist system. And lo and behold, within a couple of years, they accepted it. And of course, no one says South Africa is utopia. But yes, they accepted the thing they said we will never, never, never accept. So I think Israelis, with enough, if the status quo is not left to be cost-free for them, and that's the logic of BDS, to raise the cost of the status quo, I think Israelis can eventually accept democracy. They're not destined to be apartheid colonial occupiers forever. And I want to say that the small Israeli left, there is a small anti-Zionist Israeli left. They're not about to form a government anytime soon. They're not even in the Knesset. But what this Israeli left should do, and I think we have to be very clear since we've been lectured on what Palestinians should do, I think that Dr. Alon should go to Israel and tell this so-called Israeli left, he assures us exists, that they should be very clear in renouncing Jewish colonial privilege, renouncing the racist laws that say Palestinians cannot return home solely because they're not Jews. We should see 100,000 Israelis demonstrating in the center of Tel Aviv for the right of return, so that we can know that there is a partner and there is a peace movement, because right now I don't see that. We want Israelis to reach out to Palestinians by accepting Palestinian rights and rejecting this racist colonial system. We need to see that there's a partner. Thank you.
That's my comments, please, and we will break for coffee right after that.
I'll go back to the essential point, which is you cannot overturn a horrible racist colonial system without the people being mobilized and all its energies directed in one direction. And I believe that if we all in this room activate our memories and go back to the time when Palestinians had functioning institutions, go back to the time when if you were a student, you were part of GUBS, and if you were a writer, you were part of the Union of Writers, and if you were a Palestinian in any space in the world, you were organized in a party, and your energies were going in the direction of liberation. Now we look at the space. Palestinians do not join parties. They are not part of unions. They are not part of the national structure. At best, we have the wonderful Palestinian students in universities who are engaged in the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, but that is a limited section of the people. There are millions out there that need to join and develop and go at a bigger scale and be engaged in deliberation. Deliberation on national policy cannot just happen in track 2 rooms with Abu Mazen. They cannot happen behind closed doors. There needs to be a reclamation of the public sphere, and that's the most creative way of doing resistance. I'll end with one note, sorry. Speaking of the Israeli left, the real Israeli left actually were the very few people that joined the PLO back in the day. I'm thinking of people like Uri Davis and Halavi and others that became members of the Palestine National Council even, and some of them became members within Palestinian political parties. That's when you show real solidarity. It's when you say, you know what, I'm not operating just in terms of being an agent for reaching a deal. We're not Donald Trump here, the art of the deal. We're not trying to reach a deal. We're trying to achieve justice. If you're a genuine part of the Israeli left, your aim should be comprehensive decolonization and justice. And that means joining in with the anti-colonial struggle. And that can either happen by developing your own institutions of anti-colonial struggle, or by actually standing side by side with the Palestinians as they struggle to overthrow this racist settler colonial regime.
Well, is this live here or not? Dr. Ali wants to say a couple words.
I want to thank the organizing committee of the conference, and they're all here. This is exactly what we expected and what we wanted from the first panel, which is to have a spirited discussion, and I think you just saw that. That's wonderful. I do want to add, as we usually do, a disclaimer that we have a lot of speakers, and they have a lot of views, and the views of this